Hello, tonight we stand in a quiet world before a great turning, where the winds of the ancient Near East move through ruined walls and watchful cities, and the memory of older empires still hangs in the air like dust at dusk. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And as always, we'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what your local time is. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scene opens in the fading light of the 7th century BCE. Roads stretch across valleys and deserts, carrying merchants, soldiers, and exiles. The land feels tired. Empires have risen here before, and they have fallen with a weight that people still feel in their bones. You can almost hear the echo of marching feet along old stone streets, where the walls of distant cities remember more than their inhabitants ever could. For generations, the Neo-Assyrian Empire ruled this region with a power that was both admired and feared. Their cities, Nineveh, Ashur, Nimrud, stood like fortresses above the plains. Their kings carved their victories into stone, showing armies on the move, chariots wheeling forward, prisoners led away beneath scenes of triumph. Behind those carvings were policies that shaped real lives: forced deportations, relocated populations, entire communities uprooted so that rebellion would wither before it could take root. The strategy worked, but it left scars across the landscape, and in the quiet of the night, people whispered about the price of order. Imagine the smell of earth after rain near the Tigris, where farmers returned to their fields under watchful eyes. In those fields, fear became a habit, a shape in the background of daily life. And yet, even the strongest empire cannot silence time. Internal struggles, overextended borders, and rising enemies gathered like distant storms. By 612 BCE, the great city of Nineveh was attacked by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. Flames climbed into the sky. The empire that once seemed unbreakable collapsed, not with a single blow, but with a slow unraveling, until silence settled where power had stood. Out of the ruins emerged a new center, Babylon. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, the city glowed with splendor. Its walls rose high above the plains, its temples shimmered in the sun, and processional ways guided festivals through the heart of the city. For those who lived within its walls, Babylon could feel eternal, like a world unto itself. Yet for many beyond, it was another seat of power, another ruler who commanded, and another people who bore the weight of conquest. The Babylonians too reshaped lives. When Jerusalem fell, its elites were taken into exile, carried eastward to live beside new rivers and unfamiliar skies. These captives brought their memories with them, songs, prayers, and the hope that one day they might return. Their story would one day entwine with another figure, still far in the future, whose rule would feel different from the empires they had known. But for now, the world rested under Babylon's authority, and the night air carried both the music of celebration and the quiet of longing. Across valleys and mountains to the east, another world stirred, quieter, smaller, and often overlooked by the great powers of the day. The Persians lived in the rugged lands of Anshan and Fars, where hills rolled beneath wide skies and the earth turned pale in the evening light. They were pastoral, disciplined, shaped by hardship and distance. Their horses grazed in open fields, their communities held together through loyalty and kinship. They were not yet an empire, not yet a force spoken of in awe, but within their hills, ambition slowly gathered. Above them stood the Medes, a people whose rule stretched across high plateaus and mountain passes. The Persians were their vassals, subordinate yet essential, like a younger branch of an older tree. The Median king Astyages ruled from Ecbatana, a city ringed with walls, said to glow with color against the mountain air. Under his authority, the Persians paid tribute and followed commands, their leaders careful, patient, aware that power often moved in unseen ways before it revealed itself. The world at this time felt like a great mosaic of rival kingdoms and uncertain allegiances. Lydia lay to the west, rich in gold and trade. Babylon commanded the heart of Mesopotamia. Egypt watched from the Nile. Small kingdoms dotted the Levant. And highland tribes circled the edges of the map like shadows at the horizon. No single rule united them. Instead, there were uneasy borders, temporary agreements, and wars remembered generation after generation. At night, fires flickered along the edges of camps and city walls. Messengers rode along dusty tracks, carrying news of alliances and betrayals. Traders crossed deserts with caravans heavy with lapis, spices, and woven cloth. Somewhere, a shepherd listened to the wind on a lonely hillside, unaware that the ground beneath his feet belonged to a world on the cusp of profound change. These lands knew power, but they did not yet know Cyrus. He did not arrive as a thunderclap. There was no sudden blaze announcing his presence. Instead, he began as a quiet figure within this landscape, a child born among Persians still bound to Median authority, a boy whose early life would later grow into legend. Herodotus would one day tell stories of dreams, omens, and desperate attempts to end his life before it began. Whether those tales are history or myth, they speak to something deeper. Even centuries later, people felt that his rise must have come from something more than chance. But for now, the world continues without him at its center. Kings issue decrees, soldiers drill in courtyards, priests light incense in solemn temples. Life moves in long, careful rhythms. And yet beneath it, something subtle is shifting like the faint tremor of earth before a distant step. The weight of fear that defined earlier empires has not vanished. It lingers in memories, in old roads, in the watchfulness of those who remember the cruelty of deportation and the fragility of peace. You can almost picture the horizon at dusk, the sky washed in pale gold above distant mountains, the air cooling, the wind passing softly through dry grass. Somewhere, far from the centers of power, a small settlement settles into evening. Fires burn low, conversations fade. There is no sense that history is about to turn, and yet it will. The Near East at this moment is a world of contrasts, glory and grief, splendor and exhaustion, order and unease. Empires have taught people to obey, but they have also taught them to hope for something different, something less harsh, something that does not always rule through fear. That hope has no name yet. It has no banner, no palace, no inscription carved in stone. It is simply a possibility, fragile, uncertain, but alive. And in the quiet of those Persian hills, where the stars rise sharp and cold above the earth, a future begins to gather itself, not in loud declarations, but in silence, in endurance, and in the steady breath of a people waiting just beyond the edge of history, as somewhere, unseen, the first faint steps of a new ruler move toward the dawn. Those faint steps widen into a path, and the quiet figure behind them slowly begins to take shape, a child of the Persian hills, born into a world where loyalty is expected and power belongs to others. His name is Cyrus, son of Cambyses, descendant of a line that holds local authority but bends its knee to a greater throne. The morning air in Anshan feels cool against stone walls and open courtyards, and life unfolds in routines that seem small when measured against empires, yet firm enough to form the ground beneath a rising future. The legends about his birth drift through time like smoke that never quite settles. Herodotus tells of dreams seen by Astyages, the Median king, in which vines grew from a newborn child and covered the land, or water flowed from his daughter and flooded Asia. Alarmed, the king sought to prevent the child's rise. In these stories, a newborn is handed to a servant with orders that cannot be spoken aloud without unease. But instead of death, the child is spared, raised in obscurity, and later discovered through hints of nobility that no disguise can hide. These tales may not be literal truth, but they show how deeply people believed that Cyrus's life seemed destined, as if even his enemies feared what he might one day become. Beyond legend, the real world around him remains grounded and unromantic. The Persians herd cattle and horses, farm their difficult soil, and train for war in a manner shaped by endurance more than grandeur. The young Cyrus grows up in a landscape of hard light and long shadows, where mountains frame the horizon and the air turns sharp after sunset. He learns discipline before he learns authority. He watches how elders negotiate loyalty to the Medes while protecting the dignity of their own people. Power, he comes to understand, is never just a sword or a seal. It is a balance of promises, expectations, and the quiet willingness of others to follow. As he reaches adulthood, Cyrus inherits the role of a vassal king under Astyages. He rules his own people, but his authority is limited and always shadowed by the Median court. Tribute must be paid. Troops must be provided. Orders must be obeyed. Envoys ride back and forth between Ecbatana and Persian lands, carrying commands that remind everyone where real power sits. The distance between ruler and subject is not measured in miles, but in silence in the space where choice once existed and now does not. Yet beneath that calm exterior, murmurs begin to spread. Some Medes resent Astyages' rule. Some Persians feel that service, once tolerable, grows heavy with time. In the dim halls of the court, alliances shift like lamps flickering in the wind. One version of the story places a Median noble, Harpagus, at the center of this turning. Punished cruelly in the past by Astyages, he carries a bitterness that never entirely fades. According to later accounts, he reaches toward Cyrus with a hidden hand, encouraging rebellion, fanning embers that might otherwise have remained dormant. Whether these exact details are true or not, the pattern feels real. Power fractures from within, long before it breaks from without. The moment of open conflict arrives slowly, as so many turning points do. There is no sudden drumbeat echoing across the hills, only messages sent, loyalties tested, and lines drawn in places where they were once blurred. The Medes, confident in their strength, prepare to crush a subordinate who has forgotten his place. The Persians, smaller in number, rely on unity, endurance, and the belief that they are no longer willing to live beneath another crown. Imagine a battlefield beneath a pale sky. Dust hangs over the plain, stirred gently by the wind and the movement of men and horses. Shields catch what little light the day offers. The sound is not chaos, but a deep, steady murmur, the shifting of formations, the calling of commands, the breath of many lives held in tension at once. Somewhere within that great body of motion, Cyrus stands at the center of his people, not a figure of myth, but a leader placing his fate alongside theirs. Some accounts say that Median troops, expected to stand firm, instead falter or even join the Persians, frustrated with Astyages' harsh rule. Others describe a more straightforward rebellion, hard-fought and uncertain. The truth likely lies somewhere between story and record, less dramatic than legend, yet no less decisive. What matters is the outcome. The Medes fall, their power collapses inward, and Astyages loses the throne that once seemed immovable. When the dust finally settles, the world feels different. The Medes are not destroyed. They are folded into a new order. Cyrus does not rule as a conqueror crushing an enemy beneath his feet, but as a leader who unifies two peoples into one emerging power. Medes serve as generals, governors, and counselors in the developing state. Rather than erasing their role, he absorbs it, turning former rivals into partners in a new political body. It is here, in this choice, that the style of rule later associated with him first becomes visible. In the months that follow, the core of the future empire begins to form, not through monuments or proclamations, but through structure, loyalty, and deliberate restraint. Cities acknowledge his authority. Local elites are left space to breathe, to keep their customs and identities so long as they remain part of the growing realm. The Persians, once subordinate, now stand at the center of power, yet they do not immediately impose themselves upon everything they control. Instead, the realm expands by connection more than by force, even when force remains present in the background. You can imagine nights in the new court torchlight flickering against stone, voices rising and falling in measured tones as plans unfold. Messengers arrive from distant settlements, bringing oaths, concerns, and requests. Maps lie across tables. Roads and passes are discussed. The world that once ignored Persia now begins to reorganize itself around it, as if a new gravitational center has quietly appeared in the heart of the land. For many who had lived under the Medes, little changes at first. Fields still need tending. Markets still open at sunrise. The rhythms of daily life continue, steady and reassuring. Yet beneath that continuity is a subtle shift of emotion. Where fear once ruled, fear of sudden punishment, of unpredictable cruelty, there grows a sense, faint but real, that authority may not always mean humiliation. Leadership in Cyrus's approach feels firm but measured, strong but not needlessly harsh. It does not erase hardship from the world, but it lowers its temperature, softens its edge. There is, in this rise, a quiet reflection about the nature of power itself. Empires often claim to be eternal, yet they rest on fragile agreements between rulers and ruled, between center and border, between strength and consent. Cyrus seems to recognize that no throne survives by force alone. A realm built only on fear must constantly defend itself against those it has injured. A realm built on respect and inclusion, even imperfectly, can expand without shattering. It is not a moral revolution in the modern sense, but it is a different tone of governance, one that people notice even if they cannot yet give it a name. The Persians, once a minor people on the margins, now become the nucleus of a rising power that watches the wider world with new eyes. To the west lies Lydia, rich and confident, its king surrounded by wealth that gleams like sunlight on metal. To the south lies Babylon, formidable and ancient, a city whose name carries weight far beyond its walls. To the north and east stretch lands of tribes, mountains, and restless frontiers. Everywhere opportunities and dangers coexist in silence, waiting to be shaped by whoever has the courage or the restraint to act. Cyrus does not rush. His expansion unfolds in measured steps, each one grounded in practicality rather than spectacle. He strengthens alliances, secures borders, and ensures that those who now follow him feel that their place in the new order is not simply tolerated but recognized. The empire to come is still invisible, like an outline not yet inked onto the page. But its foundations are already present in relationships, in trust carefully earned, and in the quiet confidence of a ruler who has transformed dependency into sovereignty. You can almost see him standing on a hill at evening, overlooking the lands that once answered to another king. The sky fades from gold to deep blue. The air cools. The sounds of the camp drift softly upward, murmured conversations, the movement of animals, the slow settling of night. In that stillness, the past and future seem to meet. Behind him lies the world of vassalage, of obligation and restraint. Before him lies a path that leads not only to new conquests, but to a new idea of what power can look like when it chooses to integrate rather than simply dominate. There is no need for celebration, no triumphant cry. The moment passes quietly, like the last light fading on the horizon. But from this calm turning point, the road ahead stretches outward toward distant kingdoms, and toward a meeting with another ruler whose wealth and confidence shine brightly across the Western world, waiting among the golden river valleys of Lydia, where fortune itself will soon be tested beneath the rising steps of the Persian king. And across the plains of Lydia the name of Croesus carries the sound of gold. spoken softly in markets and palace halls where fortune seems as certain as the morning sun. The western lands feel warm and open, their fields washed in late-season light, and Sardis, the Lydian capital, rests on its hill like a jewel set above the valley. Roads lead toward it from every direction, carrying traders, envoys, and rumour. Coins of electrum stamped with royal symbols pass from hand to hand, and with every exchange the idea of Croesus's wealth grows larger than the gold itself. Here, prosperity has a texture. You can picture polished stone floors under bare feet, the faint smell of cedar and incense drifting through colonnades, and musicians' notes floating into courtyards at dusk. Lydia thrives on trade with the Greek cities along the Aegean coast, on fertile lands, and on the confidence of a king who believes that fortune favours those who act boldly. Croesus is not simply rich, he embodies the very story of wealth, a ruler whose reputation has travelled farther than his armies. To many his power feels secure, as if prosperity itself has chosen Sardis as its home. Yet Croesus is also a strategist, watchful and deliberate. He hears of Cyrus's rise in the east, the fall of Astyages, the unification of Medes and Persians, the slow but steady strengthening of a new power. To ignore such a change would be to tempt fate, and so he gathers allies, weighing his options like a player studying a board before the decisive move. His court becomes a place of counsel and calculation, where messengers arrive with news from across the mountains, and the air fills with quiet anticipation. In this time, the oracle at Delphi plays its subtle role. Croesus sends rich gifts and asks the question that echoes in so many rulers' minds. If he goes to war against the Persians, what will happen? The answer he receives is famously ambiguous, that if he crosses the Halys River, he will destroy a great empire. It is a statement that sounds reassuring, almost comforting, yet hides uncertainty within its certainty. One might say the oracle was the ancient world's way of giving advice that was never technically wrong. Croesus hears what he hopes to hear, and the path ahead seems clear. The campaign begins beneath skies that feel wide and pale. Armies march, tents rise and fall across the plains, and the rhythm of hooves echoes along dusty tracks. The Persians and Lydians meet in contested lands, and though the struggle is real, neither side yet feels the full weight of what is coming. Winter approaches. Croesus, following custom, withdraws to prepare for the next season, confident that Cyrus will do the same, but Cyrus does not. Instead, he advances with deliberate speed, refusing to give his opponent the comfort of time. The march towards Sardis is quiet, purposeful, almost restrained. The land shifts from open plains to rolling hills, and in the distance the city appears walls rising above the valley, towers catching the last light of afternoon. For the Lydians, the sight of Persian banners near their capital feels unimaginable, like a storm arriving on a day that began in calm weather. Croesus gathers his forces once more, and the stage is set on the fields near Thimbra, where the earth lies flat and exposed beneath a pale winter sky. Here, the anchor of history rests in the small details of strategy. Ancient accounts describe Cyrus using camels at the front of his formation, knowing that horses, unaccustomed to their smell, would recoil. Whether every aspect of this story is literal or partly shaped by memory, it reflects a larger truth. He wins as much through ingenuity as through force. On the field, movement replaces noise lines shifting, hooves stepping back in surprise, command structures bending under sudden uncertainty. The outcome tilts, slowly at first, then decisively. When the tension finally loosens, the Lydian army is broken and Croesus withdraws behind the walls of Sardis. The city braces for siege. Fires are lit along the ramparts, and watchmen scan the slopes as night settles gently over the hills. Within the city, fear and dignity exist side by side. Citizens gather their families, nobles whisper in shadowed corridors, and somewhere in the palace, the king stands quietly, listening to the stillness between distant sounds. The siege is short, but it feels long to those who live through it. The stories tell of a Persian soldier noticing a defender's helmet fall from the wall. The man climbs down to retrieve it, revealing a hidden path along the rock. The Persians follow this narrow approach, scaling the steep face where no one expected an assault. The moment is almost silent, a few figures moving against stone, breath shallow, hands gripping rough surfaces until the balance finally breaks and the gates of Sardis fall to the invaders. What happens next shapes Cyrus's reputation for generations. There is no orgy of destruction, no deliberate burning of the city to prove dominance. Instead, Croesus is captured and brought before the Persian king. Later traditions describe him placed upon a pyre, only for Cyrus to spare him in a flash of reconsideration. Whether this scene unfolded exactly as told or not, the core impression remains. Mercy tempers victory. Croesus, once the richest man in the world, becomes a figure preserved rather than erased, a living reminder of fortune's fragile nature. In the quiet that follows, the streets of Sardis slowly recover from fear. Stores reopen, markets resume. The city does not vanish under Persian rule. It adapts, finding continuity within change. Greek cities along the coast, once bound to Lydia, gradually come under Persian influence as well. Some resist, some negotiate, and some accept the new order, recognizing that Persia does not exist merely as a conqueror, but as a structure into which distant peoples can be drawn without losing themselves entirely. The fall of Lydia becomes more than a military event, it becomes a mirror for reflection. Wealth, once seen as unassailable, proves vulnerable. Power, once gilded and confident, yields to a force built on patience, unity, and flexible thinking. Standing in the aftermath, you can almost feel the air returning to stillness, smoke fading from campfires, the earth cooling beneath bare feet, the rustle of evening wind through dry grass along the valley floor. For Cyrus, this victory strengthens more than territory. It strengthens credibility. People begin to understand that his method of rule differs from what they have known before. Cities are not simply taken, they are absorbed, preserved, and allowed to continue breathing within a wider world. The empire is forming not as a single voice silencing others, but as a chorus where many voices remain distinct, even as they answer to the same center. At night, the palace of Sardis rests in a hush broken only by soft footsteps along stone corridors. A captured king lives not as a spectacle, but as a witness to a turning age. The Persians establish order, set administrators in place, and ensure that life flows again through the city's veins. The glow of Croesus's wealth dims, yet the city does not fade into emptiness. Instead, it becomes part of something larger, a realm stretching farther than anyone in Lydia once imagined. There is a human truth hidden beneath these events. All fortunes change. All certainty eventually becomes memory. Croesus's story, repeated across centuries, reminds listeners that no wealth, no security, and no nation is fixed beyond time. Just like us, those who lived then hoped their world would remain as it was steady, familiar, unbroken, and just like us, they learned that history moves quietly at first, then all at once. With Lydia now folded into Persian rule, the map of the Near East shifts again. To the west, the sea reflects the fading light of evening. To the north, hills roll into open distances. And to the south and east, another power waits older, larger, and wrapped in the deep pride of ancient tradition. Its walls are high, its river steady, its temples filled with incense and prayer. Its name is Babylon, and in the calm between campaigns, the road begins to turn gently toward its towering gates, where the next great moment in Cyrus's journey rests like a silent promise beneath the stars. The road stretches toward Babylon, where the earth feels older, the air heavier, and every brick seems to remember a story laid down long before Persia dreamed of empire. Travelers approaching the city see its walls rise from the plain like a horizon made by human hands, broad, layered and steady, touched by torchlight that glows along parapets and towers as evening settles in. The Euphrates moves through its heart, slow and deliberate, a dark ribbon reflecting faint firelight from windows and courtyards. To look upon Babylon is to feel the presence of centuries gathered into one place, a city that calls itself the center of the world and speaks the claim with quiet certainty. Inside those walls, life stretches from temple to marketplace, from palace corridor to narrow street, where dust hangs in the warm air. Priests tend to rituals that link the present to the mythic past. Merchants arrange goods beneath shaded awnings, while scribes press reeds into clay tablets, leaving soft impressions that fix contracts, prayers, and everyday concerns into memory. The ziggurat rises upward in deliberate steps, a staircase of stone built not for feet but for imagination, and from its summit the city seems endless, roofs layered like waves, gardens hidden behind walls, and the steady, faithful current of the river below. For generations, Babylon has stood not only as a city but as an idea, order, culture, and mastery over the land. Its rulers believe that time itself leans toward them, that history, whatever happens elsewhere, eventually returns to these gates. Yet beneath this confidence lies a quieter truth: political tensions, dissatisfied factions, and a ruler whose decisions do not always match the expectations of his people. Nabonidus, seated on the throne, has turned his attention toward religious policies that unsettle parts of the priestly class and weaken bonds that once held court and city together. The empire surrounding Babylon appears whole, but inside, the threads strain softly. Beyond its borders, Cyrus watches with patient intent. He has seen how empires collapse not only from battle, but from the internal distance that grows between ruler and ruled. His campaign toward Babylon begins not in haste, but with deliberate preparation. Armies move through the land, securing routes, negotiating with local leaders, and presenting themselves not as destroyers, but as a force promising stability. The approach is quiet, measured, and almost cautious, as if the Persians understand that a city like Babylon cannot be taken by force alone. It must be entered in a way that preserves its dignity as much as its walls. The Euphrates becomes the silent key in this unfolding story. Ancient accounts describe how Persian engineers divert sections of the river, guiding its waters into trenches so that the level inside the city drops low. By night, the current falls enough that soldiers can wade along its bed beneath bridges and walls, following the water's dark, exposed path. It is not a storm of ladders and breaking gates, but a careful movement armor held close to the body. Steps placed slowly, the sound of water slipping past legs and stone. The city that once seemed impregnable opens not through violence, but through patience and understanding of its lifeblood. Inside, many residents continue their routines, unaware of what is unfolding. Some traditions even suggest that festivities or ritual observances fill the night, music and laughter drifting faintly above rooms and courtyards. Whether or not every detail of these stories is exact, they echo a deeper reality. Babylon does not fall in a blaze of chaos, but in a quiet moment when the guards of history briefly look away. By the time the city realizes what has happened, the Persians are already within its heart, not as vandals, but as a presence, calm and unhurried. This is the moment where Cyrus's character shapes the course of events. He does not burn temples, does not allow his soldiers to claim the city as a prize to be stripped bare. Instead, he presents himself as a restorer, one who honors Marduk, the city's great god, and respects the traditions that give Babylon its identity. The Cyrus cylinder, set in clay and inscribed with careful lines, reflects this choice. It speaks of returning displaced peoples to their homelands, of restoring sanctuaries and lifting burdens imposed by previous rulers. Modern readers debate how far its promises extend by our standards, but for its time, it marks a profound shift in the language of power. Victory defined not only by conquest, but by reassurance. Among those affected by his policies are communities carried into exile decades earlier, including the Jewish people taken from their homeland by the Babylonians. Cyrus grants permission for them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, a gesture that echoes through their memory in scripture. In their writings, he becomes not just a foreign ruler, but an instrument of deliverance, a king who acts with unexpected sympathy toward a displaced nation. To them, his rule feels not like a new captivity, but like a door quietly opening after a long night. In the streets of Babylon, the change in rule unfolds with subdued calm. Administrators remain at their posts, markets reopen, and the river continues its steady course through the city's center. The great metropolis is not shattered, it is guided into a new order. People notice that offices remain staffed, records continue to be kept, and temples resume their rituals under the watch of a ruler who does not seek to erase what came before. The empire that grows around Cyrus does not flatten the cultures it absorbs, it shelters them, as if each city becomes a room within a larger house rather than a wall broken and left in ruins. You can almost imagine the first nights after the transition, lamps glowing inside palace chambers, couriers moving along polished corridors with quiet steps, the murmured voices of priests and governors speaking of continuity rather than collapse. Outside, the city exhales, the dust of fear settles. Those who feared sudden destruction instead witness a gentler kind of authority, one that claims power but does not insist upon scorn. In that difference, trust begins to form, not loudly, but with the slow certainty of a stone settling firmly into place. There is a reflective truth beneath these events. Sometimes the greatest changes do not sound like thunder. They arrive like a door opening in the dimness, or like a river lowering by a hand few notice until after the fact. Babylon's fall does not feel like humiliation to those who experience it. It feels like a turning of the world's direction, firm, inevitable, yet strangely calm. People continue their lives with the awareness that something vast has shifted, yet the streets, the temples, the fields beyond the walls remain. A new power governs, but the city's soul endures. For Cyrus, this moment becomes the heart of his reputation. Conquest in his hands is not simply victory over another people, it is the assumption of responsibility for their well-being. He brings stability where unrest had spread, offers legitimacy to traditions that feel threatened, and binds his expanding realm through respect rather than erasure. This approach does not dissolve conflict or hardship, but it reshapes the emotional landscape of empire. Those who live beneath Persian rule may not always rejoice, but many learn they do not have to tremble. At the same time, the practical foundations of empire begin to deepen. Administrators coordinate tribute and law. Roads stretch outward from the city, connecting newly unified territories. Letters pass between courts with growing speed, carried across long distances by relay systems that will soon become one of the empire's great achievements. Babylon, once the undisputed center of its own world, now becomes a vital heart within a larger organism, its culture preserved, its influence continued, but its sovereignty folded into the larger structure of Persian authority. Standing on the riverbank at dusk, you might picture Cyrus looking across the slow-moving water, the lamps of the city reflected in shifting fragments upon its surface. The air is warm, touched by the faint smell of clay and reeds. The sounds of evening drift over the water, the call of a distant voice, the soft scrape of a boat against wood, the gentle stir of wind brushing across stone. In that stillness, Babylon no longer appears as a prize won in war, but as a living presence entrusted to his care. The conquest becomes not a climax, but a beginning. From here, the empire must be shaped, guided, and sustained. Every city added to its breadth brings new voices, new customs, new layers of responsibility. The challenge ahead is not to win more battles, but to hold together what has already been gathered, to create a structure that can carry many peoples without breaking under its own weight. In this quiet turning point, the future of Persia ceases to be a matter of swords and becomes a matter of governance. Night deepens over Babylon, cloaking rooftops and courtyards in gentle darkness. The river glides onward, untroubled by the change of rulers, as if reminding all who watch that time flows whether men rise or fall. Above the city, the sky stretches clear and silent, and in that silence rests a question. How does an empire built by conquest transform itself into a world held together by order, roads, and shared purpose? Where distant provinces remain loyal not out of fear, but through a fragile, carefully tended trust. The empire that followed Cyrus's victories did not arise from chaos or chance. It grew with intention, as if a careful hand were shaping lines across mountains, plains, and river valleys. After the banners were lowered in conquered cities and the sound of marching faded from their streets, a different kind of work began, quieter, slower, and perhaps even more impressive than war. It was the work of turning victory into stability, of transforming conquest into governance, and of building a structure that could endure beyond the life of a single king. Across the vast territory now under Persian control, people spoke dozens of languages, followed different laws, and worshipped different gods. In earlier empires, unity meant pressure, suppression, and fear, but under the Achaemenids, the idea of empire took on a new shape. Power was still firm, authority still absolute, yet it rested on a foundation that allowed difference to survive rather than be erased. The Persians understood that ruling such a world required more than soldiers and fortresses. It required organization, respect, and the ability to let people continue their lives without feeling that their entire world had been broken apart. The empire was divided into great regions called satrapies, each one large enough to encompass multiple cities and peoples, yet small enough to be supervised by a single official. These satraps were governors, often drawn from Persian nobility or trusted local elites, and they stood as the king's representatives, far from the royal heartland. Their duties blended military command, civil administration, and financial oversight. They collected tribute, enforced royal decrees, maintained order, and ensured that the machinery of empire kept turning day after day. But satraps were not free agents. Alongside them stood royal inspectors, tax officials, and military officers who answered directly to the king, forming a layered system that balanced trust with constant oversight. This architecture of power was both practical and psychological. It allowed local customs and institutions to remain in place, giving people a sense that life continued even under new rulers. At the same time, it reminded every province that their loyalty reached beyond their city walls, upward toward a distant court, and a monarch whose authority stretched across continents. In this balance, rebellion became less appealing, and collaboration more natural. People could live according to familiar traditions, yet know that those traditions existed now within something larger, an imperial order that wrapped around them like a vast and steady horizon. Communication lay at the center of this order. The distances of the empire were immense, and without swift information, even the most careful system could splinter. So the Persians built roads not just rough tracks or simple paths, but engineered highways carved into the landscape with an eye for endurance and speed. The most famous of these, the Royal Road, stretched across the heart of the empire, linking cities and regions like a great artery. Along it stood relay stations where couriers could rest, change horses, and continue onward without delay. Through this network, messages travelled with remarkable speed for the ancient world, allowing the king to project presence even into lands he might never personally see. These roads were more than tools of administration. They became channels of trade, culture, and movement. Merchants carried textiles, metals, and precious stones along their length. Travelers brought stories, news, and ideas from one side of the empire to the other. Local markets began to feel less isolated, as goods from distant lands appeared on their stalls. Over time, a sense of shared connection formed, not a single culture replacing many, but many cultures anchored within a shared framework of stability and exchange. Money, too, took on new meaning. The Achaemenid administration developed standardized coinage, allowing transactions to move beyond barter and complex ledgers. Coins bearing royal symbols circulated across regions that had once used entirely different economic systems. With them came a new ease of trade and taxation, a rhythm that supported markets, armies, and public works alike. Wealth could now flow more efficiently, binding distant corners of the empire into the same financial reality. Justice formed another pillar of imperial structure. The Persians did not erase local law, they recognized its deep roots within communities. Instead, they allowed many societies to retain their legal traditions while overlaying them with royal authority. Judges and officials worked within existing frameworks, yet answered ultimately to the central state. In this way, the empire did not deny identity, it surrounded it, moderated it, and made it function alongside others without dissolving its character. People who might once have feared conquerors discovered that life could continue with familiar rhythms, even as they became subjects of a distant throne. Religion, perhaps more than anything else, revealed the distinct nature of Persian governance. Temples were not torn down, shrines were not defiled. Instead, sacred spaces were often protected, restored, or even supported by royal resources. This policy was practical. It prevented unrest and encouraged loyalty, but it also reflected a worldview in which different peoples and their gods could exist within a common political space. The return of exiled communities, the rebuilding of sanctuaries, and the freedom to worship reinforced a sense that empire did not always have to mean spiritual destruction. At the symbolic center of this structure stood the royal court, a place where ceremony, administration, and diplomacy intertwined. Here, representatives from across the empire arrived bearing tribute, gifts, and petitions. They spoke in different tongues, wore different clothing, and represented lands separated by oceans, mountains, and deserts. Yet within the halls of power, they stood together as parts of a single political order. The court did not simply display power, it performed unity, showing the world that distance and difference could still bend toward a single authority. Architecture expressed that same message in stone and column. In the cities of the Persian heartland, vast complexes rose from the ground, terraced platforms, grand halls, and sculpted reliefs showing processions of peoples from every corner of the empire. These scenes were not merely decorative. They illustrated the vision of the Achaemenid state, a world gathered peacefully under one rule, each culture distinct yet accepted, each delegation stepping forward with dignity rather than humiliation. The built environment became a statement of order, calm, disciplined, and deliberately inclusive. Logistics supported everything beneath this vision. Supplies were stored in vast warehouses, records inscribed on clay tablets, rations distributed to workers, officials, and soldiers across multiple regions. The empire functioned as a living system, pulsing with movement and planning. Even its military garrisons, stationed across key locations, served not only as instruments of force but as custodians of stability. Their presence discouraged revolts and protected trade routes, allowing everyday life to proceed without constant fear of disruption. Yet this structure was never motionless. It adapted as new lands were added, new challenges emerged, and new rulers shaped its priorities. Some satraps grew ambitious, some regions strained against control. The Persians responded with inspections, reforms, and careful adjustments, sustaining an empire that stretched farther than any before it. Where earlier powers had relied heavily on fear alone, The Achaemenids fused order with pragmatism, authority with accommodation. Their empire breathed not as a rigid machine, but as a flexible framework built to last. In this blend of administration and tolerance, a new political model emerged, one that future states would study, imitate, and sometimes fail to match. Roads, coinage, provincial governance, and religious moderation became elements of a broader legacy that extended beyond borders and centuries. The Achaemenid realm was not perfect, and its rule could still be harsh when challenged. But it offered a glimpse of how power might operate without erasing the people it governed, how difference might be managed without being crushed. As the empire settled into its vast geography, its rhythm grew steady. Caravans moved beneath open skies, governors reviewed accounts in distant capitals, priests lit lamps in temples left standing, and messengers rode through the night along the royal road. Behind the quiet of these ordinary moments stood an idea carefully built from policy, design, and restraint. An empire meant not only to conquer, but to endure. In the centuries after his death, Cyrus did not remain only a figure of battles, conquests, and royal decrees. He began to change shape in the memories of those who spoke about him, wrote about him, and tried to understand the meaning of his rule. History preserved the outline of his actions, the founding of an empire, the fall of kings, the taking of cities, but memory did something more. It turned him into a symbol, a model of what a ruler could be, and sometimes what a ruler ought to be. Between fact and reflection, he became an image that lived far beyond his own lifetime. Even in the ancient world, people already spoke of Cyrus with a tone different from the one used for most conquerors. The Persian inscriptions carved after his time rarely drown in self-praise or violence. Instead, they describe order brought to disorder, peace restored after chaos, and a world gathered together under a ruler who saw himself not only as a master of lands, but as a guardian of harmony. Whether these words reflected the full reality is something historians still debate, yet they reveal how Persians wanted to remember him not only as a warrior, but as a founder whose authority rested on justice as much as on force. Outside Persia, other voices added their own layers to his image. In the traditions of the people once exiled in Babylon, Cyrus appeared not as an enemy, but as a liberator. He allowed displaced communities to return to their homelands, to rebuild temples, and to restore religious life that had been interrupted by conquest. For them, his arrival did not mean another chain placed upon them. It meant the loosening of one that already existed. Over time, this gratitude became woven into sacred narrative. Cyrus was remembered not simply as a foreign king, but as an instrument of providence, a ruler whose decision aligned with hopes that had survived years of loss. In this telling, he stood as proof that power and compassion did not always have to oppose one another. Yet memory is never simple. Other accounts depicted him in ways shaped by Greek curiosity and reflection. Writers such as Herodotus and Xenophon turned Cyrus into a subject of inquiry, part historical figure, part moral example, part philosophical experiment. For them, Cyrus was more than a name in a chronicle. He became a lens through which to examine leadership, character, discipline, and the fragile balance between ambition and restraint. Though these works do not always match the facts modern historians reconstruct, they helped create one of the most influential portraits of Cyrus, a ruler who possessed courage, cleverness, self-control, and a rare sense of moderation. Xenophon, especially, crafted a vision of Cyrus that would echo across the centuries. In his writing, the Persian king appears as a leader who wins loyalty not only through command, but through trust. He listens, persuades, and treats allies and subjects with dignity. Discipline is not shown as cruelty but as clarity. Authority does not suffocate, it guides. Whether Xenophon's Cyrus mirrors the real man or represents an ideal imagined by the author, the effect was powerful. Generations of readers would encounter Cyrus not primarily as a conqueror, but as a model, someone who demonstrated how power could be exercised with reason instead of excess. This transformation from ruler to ideal meant that Cyrus's image no longer belonged only to the past. Philosophers, statesmen, and political thinkers read about him and found lessons they believed could apply to their own worlds. In classrooms, courts, and private studies, his story became a case study in statecraft. Some admired the unity he forged from different peoples. Others saw in him a reminder that mercy could coexist with strength. Still others simply perceived a figure who seemed larger than circumstance, a man whose choices revealed possibilities not always visible in the harsher politics of their own time. Yet myth and admiration also created distance from reality. The harsher dimensions of empire, the burdens of tribute, the presence of armies, and the hierarchy that placed Persian authority above countless subject communities did not disappear simply because later writers emphasized virtue. The real Cyrus ruled within a world of conquest, power, and imperial ambition. Fields still fed soldiers, roads still carried orders enforcing obedience. Even a just empire remained an empire. To remember him only as a benevolent figure risks overlooking the complexities that made his rule possible. And still, the fact that so many traditions chose to remember him in gentler tones says something about what people long to see in leadership. Across cultures and eras, the stories of Cyrus reflected a shared desire that rulers might act with restraint, that victory might not demand cruelty, and that strength might be used not only to dominate, but to stabilize and restore. Cyrus became the vessel for that hope. Whether every aspect of that image was historically accurate mattered less than the moral shape it offered, a shape others could point to when questioning the behavior of their own leaders. As centuries passed, his legacy continued to evolve. Empires rose and vanished. New rulers claimed legitimacy by recalling older traditions. Some invoked Cyrus as a founding presence, a distant ancestor of authority whose spirit still hovered over the land. Others, far beyond Persia, saw him as a symbol of enlightened kingship, a reminder that power could sometimes align with fairness. Scholars debated his actions, storytellers embellished his character, monuments and texts kept his memory alive, even when the physical traces of his reign faded from the earth. In this way, Cyrus came to occupy a space between history and aspiration. He was real, a man who fought, governed, marched, and made decisions that affected millions. But he was also imagined reshaped by those who remembered him, studied him, or needed him to represent a certain vision of political life. He lived twice, once in his own century, and again in every generation that reinterpreted him. When we look back today, we see both of these Cyruses at once. We see the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, the strategist who united Persian tribes and defeated powerful kingdoms. But we also see the figure who emerged afterward, the wise leader praised for moderation, the liberator remembered in scripture, the ruler idealized by philosophers, the archetype of justice invoked by thinkers who would never walk the lands he once ruled. Between the stone, the story, and the reflection, a question lingers. Was Cyrus truly different from the conquerors who came before and after him, or did memory decide that he should be? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the middle. His policies of tolerance, his treatment of conquered peoples, and the administrative foundation he established do suggest a ruler more careful and pragmatic than many of his predecessors. At the same time, the myths around him reveal more about human longing than about the full reality of imperial rule. Yet regardless of where history ends and interpretation begins, the image of Cyrus endures because it offers something rare in the story of power, the possibility that greatness does not have to rest only on fear. His legacy invites reflection on responsibility, restraint, and the moral weight of leadership. It shows how the memory of a single person can become a mirror in which entire societies examine their own ideas about justice and authority. And so, Cyrus stands across time not only as a king, but as a symbol, a figure who drifted beyond his own life into the realm of ideals, where rulers are measured not just by what they conquered, but by how they chose to rule, and by the values others saw or hoped to see reflected in their shadow. And in that shadow, the final years of Cyrus's life move quietly toward the horizon, where duty still calls him beyond the safe heart of his empire. Power had expanded in wide circles from the valleys of Persia to the plains of Lydia and the great avenues of Babylon, but the edges of that world remained unsettled. To the northeast stretched lands of open steppe and wandering peoples' communities who did not live behind walls or within cities, but followed herds across the wide horizon. They did not measure strength through monuments or palaces. They measured it through survival, movement, and the ability to endure harsh seasons of wind and dust. Reports reached the king of raids, border tensions, and tribes who resisted the calm order he had tried to establish. The Massagetae, a powerful confederation beyond the Oxus, lived in this shifting frontier. Ancient writers describe them as fierce, independent, and proud of their freedom. They did not easily accept the authority of distant kings, and they viewed the spread of Cyrus's empire with suspicion. Whether the final campaign began as defense, ambition, or an attempt to secure restless borders, the result was the same. The aging ruler once more gathered his army and turned his face toward the unknown lands of the steppe. The journey northward was long and exposed. You can almost sense the scale of it, the steady rhythm of marching feet, the creak of wagons, the quiet breath of horses in cold morning air. The land opened like an endless sea of grass, broken only by low hills and distant rivers. Nights were wide and star-filled. Days were marked by pale light and a wind that never seemed to stop. Here, far from the cities he had governed with such care, Cyrus walked again as a commander rather than a builder, a traveller rather than a king seated on a throne. Ancient accounts differ in their details, but they share a sense of risk. Some say Cyrus attempted negotiation, others describe ambush and counter-ambush, the uncertain rhythm of movement and retreat across a landscape with no natural boundaries. Among the figures who step out of the story is Queen Tamiris, the leader of the Massagetae in several classical traditions, a woman portrayed as resolute, unyielding, and deeply protective of her people's independence. Whether every word about her is literal history or later storytelling, she stands in the narratives as a mirror to Cyrus, another sovereign, another will, another center of power. The confrontation that followed did not unfold like the great sieges of cities or the measured campaigns of the imperial heartland. There were no high walls, no river banks to redirect, no gates to open quietly at night. Instead, the battle, however it truly occurred, took place beneath the open sky, where distance itself became part of the struggle. Dust rose, formations stretched thin. The neat geometry of imperial armies met the fluid movement of steppe warriors who knew every fold of their homeland. In these traditions, the outcome turns against Cyrus. Herodotus writes that the Massagetae prevailed, that the Persians were overcome far from the security of their own lands, and that the great king who had defeated so many met his end not in triumph, but in vulnerability. The details may remain uncertain, lost between memory and interpretation, but the broader truth is clear enough. The founder of the Persian Empire did not die in his palace or among courtiers. His last breath belonged to the borderlands, to the lonely expanse where empire met resistance and where certainty dissolved into legend. What followed was movement once again, but slower now, more deliberate, touched with grief. The body of Cyrus, according to long tradition, was brought back across the distances he had once crossed in life. Steppe gave way to valleys, valleys to roads, and roads to the familiar soil of Persia. There, in Pasargadae, the early capital he had shaped with care, a tomb awaited that did not imitate the wealth of conquered cities or the heavy monuments of older empires. It was simple, almost austere, a stepped platform, a small stone chamber, and an inscription remembered through centuries in paraphrase, a quiet message to those who might stand before it and read. "O man, I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire." No boast about endless riches, no long list of victories, only a direct reminder of what had been created and a human presence behind it. Stone endured where life had ended, the wind moved around the structure, and the landscape spread outward in calm silence. Those who visited would have seen not a king in splendor, but a resting place marked by restraint, as if the work he had begun needed no louder monument. The transition of power did not end with his passing. The empire continued, taken up by his son Cambyses II, and later strengthened and reorganized under Darius. Roads remained in use, administrators kept records, satraps governed, and distant peoples still lived beneath the wide umbrella Cyrus had opened. His death did not close the story of the Achaemenid world, it changed its voice. Leadership shifted, priorities evolved, and the empire learned to survive without the man who had first given it shape. Yet even as politics moved forward, memory held to the moment of his final campaign. The contrast between his achievements and his end carried a quiet lesson that spoke across cultures and generations, that no power, however vast, can outrun the limits of human life. That even founders meet the same horizon as those who never held a throne. In that recognition, there is a trace of humility, a reminder that the legacy of a ruler rests not only in how he rises, but also in how his story settles into the long silence afterward. Standing in Pasargadae today, one might imagine the distant echo of footsteps, the rustle of dry grass, the outline of the tomb beneath a calm sky. The empire he began would last for 2 centuries. His memory would last far longer, shaped and reshaped by storytellers, pilgrims, scholars, and rulers who saw in him either a lesson, a warning, or a source of inspiration. The final campaign faded into legend, but the idea of Cyrus the founder, the just king, the figure balanced between history and memory, continued to travel through time. And as the light softens over those quiet stones, the story does not close. It turns gently toward the deeper echo of what remains after empires pass, toward the lingering idea of a rule built on order and restraint, waiting beneath the stars for anyone who pauses long enough to listen. And in that stillness, the idea he left behind seems to breathe more softly than the stones themselves, an idea not carved in power alone, but in the quiet balance between authority and restraint. The ruins rest beneath a wide sky, the outlines of Pasargadae faintly silvered by moonlight, and the empire that once stretched across mountains, deserts, and seas now lingers mostly in memory. Yet memory, like the wind moving across the plain, does not vanish. It reshapes, returns, and settles again. What endured after Cyrus was more than territory or armies. Roads could crumble, palaces could fall, and dynasties could fade. But the model of rule he shaped, or that countless generations believed he shaped, continued to travel through time. His empire was not imagined as one built only on fear, but on a kind of order that allowed people, languages, and customs to survive beneath its protection. Even if reality was imperfect, the aspiration itself mattered. It became a thread woven into the story of how power might exist without extinguishing the worlds it governed. As later rulers looked back, they saw in Cyrus not only a founder, but a precedent. His successors in the Achaemenid line expanded, reorganized, and strengthened the state he began, yet many still stood in his shadow, measuring their own authority against the memory of his moderation. Far beyond Persia, others watched from a distance and drew their own lessons. Greek writers described him with fascination and respect. Philosophers treated his life as a study in leadership and character. The idea of Cyrus flowed outward, crossing frontiers as easily as the old imperial roads. Centuries later, long after the Achaemenid banners had disappeared from the world, that idea still reached new minds. Conquerors and statesmen studied his image, sometimes as inspiration, sometimes as contrast, sometimes simply as a reminder that greatness did not always have to shout. Alexander the Great, according to ancient accounts, is said to have visited the tomb at Pasargadae, standing in quiet recognition before the resting place of a ruler he both admired and surpassed in territory. In that moment, two visions of empire touched briefly, one driven by relentless ambition, the other remembered for discipline and restraint. Later civilizations also found meaning in his legacy. Rome, with its vast administration and layered citizenship, echoed elements of the imperial structure first tested in Persian lands. Philosophers and political thinkers, reading ancient texts, saw in Cyrus a figure who seemed to represent the possibility of ruling without erasing the people who lived beneath the crown. Whether they viewed him historically or symbolically, they treated his example as a reference point, a light held up against the darker histories of conquest. And there, among the fragments of clay and the faded lines of inscriptions, lies the Cyrus cylinder, often described as an early expression of something larger than empire, a declaration of tolerance, restoration, and the dignity of communities allowed to live according to their beliefs. Modern scholars debate its meaning in careful detail, but its voice remains calm and practical, speaking of temples rebuilt, exiles returned, and disorder replaced by stability. It does not sound like a boast. It sounds like a promise that a ruler could choose preservation instead of destruction. Standing in the night air, with the ruins spread quietly across the ground, you can almost sense how these ideas lingered long after the political structures themselves had faded. Empires rise, reshape themselves, and vanish, but the memory of how they ruled becomes part of the inheritance of the world. Cyrus's legacy rests there not only in the outline of capitals or the reach of armies, but in the enduring belief that power does not need to devour what it governs. There is a gentle irony in the simplicity of his tomb compared to the size of his empire. The stones do not tower like later monuments. They do not overwhelm the landscape. They sit with humility, as if suggesting that the true measure of rule might lie not in height or weight, but in the character of what survives after the ruler is gone. The land around it is open, the air still, and the silence carries farther than any proclamation once did. And so the empire recedes into history, but the idea remains an idea of strength guided by mercy, of authority tempered by respect, of conquest followed not by ruin but by integration. It is not a perfect story, nor a simple one. It lives somewhere between fact and memory, policy and hope, stone and sky. Yet it endures because people continue to return to it, to examine it, to ask what kind of world might emerge when power chooses not only to command, but to protect. Under the stars above Pasargadae, nothing moves quickly. Time feels wide, patient, unhurried. The wind touches the grass, the stones hold their place. And in that quiet, the shadow of Cyrus's vision stretches farther than his armies ever marched, not as a shout across history, but as a steady, lasting echo of an empire that tried, however imperfectly, to rule without extinguishing the many worlds that lived within it.